Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a house built without a single nail. Not because nails didn't exist, but because they were considered an insult to the wood. Imagine walls made of paper that glow like lanterns at sunset. Rooms that breathe with the seasons, expanding in summer, contracting in winter, always in conversation with the world outside. This is not fantasy. This is the story of the traditional Japanese house, a story that stretches back over 2,000 years. From pit dwellings dug into the earth, to the elegant machiya of Kyoto, and the soaring timber frames of the Ise Grand Shrine. Japanese architecture is often described with three words: wood, paper, and space. But these simple materials conceal a philosophy so profound that it shaped not just how the Japanese lived, but how they thought about nature, family, social hierarchy, and even the passage of time itself. The Japanese house was never just a shelter. It was a spiritual machine, a social stage, and a work of art, all at once. In the next hour, we will journey through rain-soaked thatched roofs in the mountains of Shirakawa-go, step into the candlelit chambers of Heian period nobility, sit in the austere tea room of a 16th-century tea master, and walk the narrow corridors of a Kyoto merchant's townhouse. We will discover why Japanese carpenters could spend 10 years learning to cut a single joint, why the nobility slept on the floor while the emperor sat above it, and why a house made of paper could survive earthquakes that shattered stone castles. This is the history of traditional Japanese houses, not as museums, but as living ideas that continue to whisper through the concrete and glass of modern Tokyo. Our story begins, not with elegance, but with necessity. Around 10,000 BCE, as the glaciers retreated from the Japanese archipelago, the first permanent settlers arrived. These were the Jomon people, hunter-gatherers who lived in a land of dense forests, volcanic mountains, and violent typhoons. They needed shelter, and they found it by literally digging into the earth. The Tateana Jukyo, or pit dwelling, was as primitive as architecture gets, yet it contained the seed of something distinctly Japanese. These homes were circular or oval pits, roughly 1 to 2 meters deep, roofed with thatch made of wild grass, bark, or reeds, and supported by wooden posts. A central hearth provided heat and light, and the smoke, rather than escaping through a chimney, simply seeped through the thatch, waterproofing it and driving away insects. Archaeologists have excavated thousands of these dwellings across Japan, from Hokkaido to Kyushu. At the Sannai Maruyama site in Aomori, a vast Jomon village has been preserved, revealing pit houses up to 32 meters in length, enormous for their time, suggesting communal living or ceremonial functions. These were not mere holes in the ground. The Jomon people lined their floors with clay, plastered the walls, and decorated their spaces with lacquered pottery and elaborate clay figurines. But the most important legacy of the pit dwelling was conceptual. The Japanese house began as a space defined by the floor. In Western architecture, walls define rooms. In Japanese architecture, the floor defines the space. The sunken hearth, the raised sleeping platform, the earthen floor for cooking, these zones would evolve over millennia into the tatami-covered rooms and doma entryways of later periods. By the Yayoi period, around 300 BCE, agriculture arrived from the Asian mainland, and with it came a revolution in housing. Rice cultivation required storage, and storage required elevation. The first raised floor buildings, takayuka, appeared, simple granaries on stilts that protected precious grain from humidity and rodents. This simple structural innovation would eventually transform Japanese domestic architecture forever. The transition from pit dwelling to raised floor house was not merely practical, it was spiritual. In Shinto, the indigenous religion of Japan, the ground itself is both sacred and potentially defiled. The kami, or spirits, dwell in pure spaces, mountaintops, waterfalls, ancient trees. To live close to the earth was to risk spiritual contamination. To rise above it was to approach the divine. By the Kofun period, around 300 to 538 CE, elevated storehouses and early shrine architecture had become widespread. The most famous example is the Ise Grand Shrine, rebuilt every 20 years for over 13 centuries, using identical techniques and materials. Its inner sanctum, the Shoden, sits on piles driven directly into the ground, its floor raised high above the forest floor. This is architecture as ritual, as eternal renewal. But it was in the Asuka and Nara periods, when Buddhism arrived from Korea and China, that Japanese domestic architecture began to truly distinguish itself from continental models. Chinese and Korean palaces were built on stone foundations, with walls of rammed earth and tile roofs. The Japanese adopted these forms at first. The imperial palace at Heijō-kyo was essentially a Chinese-style compound. Yet something different was happening in the provinces. Japanese carpenters, working with an abundance of softwood, cedar, cypress, pine, developed techniques that embraced the material's flexibility rather than fighting it. Instead of stone foundations, they used wooden posts set directly on stone pads. Instead of rigid walls, they created post and beam frames that could flex and absorb the seismic energy that periodically shattered the archipelago. The house became a wooden skeleton, with infill panels that could be removed, replaced, or reconfigured at will. This flexibility was not just structural, it was social. The Japanese house had no fixed rooms in the Western sense. Space was defined by movable screens, by the placement of objects, by the occasion rather than the architecture. A room could be a bedroom at night, a reception hall in the morning, and a meditation space by afternoon. This concept of space as fluid, as theatrical, as responsive to human need, would become the defining characteristic of Japanese architecture for the next 1,000 years. If you could travel back to Kyoto in the year 1000 CE, you would find a city that existed in a state of almost unbearable beauty. The Heian period, lasting from 794 to 1185, was Japan's classical age, an era of poetry, courtly romance, and aesthetic refinement so extreme that nobles reportedly wept at the sight of a perfectly arranged autumn leaf. And at the center of this world stood the Shinden-zukuri, the aristocratic villa that remains one of the most poetic architectural forms ever created. The Shinden-zukuri was not a house in the conventional sense. It was a landscape, with buildings scattered through it like islands in a lake. The central hall, the Shinden itself, was a long rectangular building facing south, its floor raised above the ground on wooden posts. To the east and west stood subsidiary pavilions, connected to the main hall by covered corridors that arched over artificial ponds. The entire compound was surrounded by a garden that was not merely decorative, but functional. The pond provided water for firefighting, the trees offered shade, and the garden itself was an extension of the living space. Inside, the Shinden was divided by movable screens and curtains. There were no permanent walls, no fixed furniture. The floor was made of polished wood, and the nobility sat directly upon it, their rank determined by how close they sat to the center. In winter, portable braziers provided warmth. In summer, the screens were removed entirely, and the house became an open pavilion, its inhabitants cooled by breezes drifting across the pond. The most famous Shinden-zukuri was the Byodo Inn, originally a private villa built by the powerful Fujiwara clan in 1052. Its Phoenix Hall, Amida-do, is the only surviving example of this architectural type, and it reveals the Shinden-zukuri's essential character. It was a stage for the performance of beauty. Every element, the reflection of the hall and the pond, the precise placement of azaleas, the angle of the corridors, was calculated to create a specific aesthetic experience. Yet the Shinden-zukuri was also a prison of protocol. The architecture enforced a rigid social hierarchy. The emperor sat at the northernmost point, facing south, the position of authority in Chinese cosmology. Courtiers arranged themselves in precise formations according to rank. Even the direction one faced while sleeping was dictated by custom. The house was beautiful because it had to be. It was the only world these aristocrats knew. They rarely left their compounds, and when they did, they traveled in enclosed palanquins, seeing the world through bamboo blinds. By the late Heian period, the Shinden-zukuri had become impossibly expensive to maintain. The Fujiwara clan's wealth, built on tax revenues from provincial estates, began to decline. And a new class was rising, warriors from the eastern provinces who cared little for poetry and much for power. The age of the floating world was ending, and with it, the Shinden-zukuri would fade into memory, preserved only in painted scrolls and the dreams of nostalgics. The Kamakura and Muromachi periods, from 1185 to 1573, transformed Japan from an aristocratic paradise into a warrior's realm. The samurai, with their codes of loyalty and austerity, had little patience for the poetic excesses of the Heian court. They needed houses that reflected their values, discipline, hierarchy, and a cultivated simplicity that masked deadly sophistication. The Shoin-zukuri was their answer. The word shoin originally meant study, a small room with a built-in desk, bookshelves, and an alcove. It was a space for reading, for writing, for the contemplation of Chinese philosophy. But as the Muromachi shoguns grew in power, the shoin expanded from a private study into the architectural template for the entire warrior residence. The key innovation of Shoin-zukuri was the tokonoma, an elevated alcove, usually in the corner of the main reception room, designed for the display of a single hanging scroll and a simple flower arrangement. The tokonoma was not merely decorative, it was sacred space. Guests of honor would be seated before it, and the objects displayed within it were chosen to reflect the season, the occasion, and the host's aesthetic sensibility. To step into a shoin room was to enter a curated world where every object had meaning. But the most revolutionary change was underfoot. During the Muromachi period, tatami, woven rush mats, transformed from luxury items used only by the nobility into the standard flooring of the warrior class. A tatami mat is exactly 90 by 180 centimeters, a ratio of 1 to 2, and this precise dimension became the fundamental module of Japanese architecture. Rooms were no longer measured in feet or meters, but in mats. A 4.5 mat room, an 8 mat room. The tatami was not just a floor covering, it was a grid that organized space, movement, and social interaction. The shoin room also introduced fixed architectural elements that had been unknown in the fluid Shinden-zukuri. The chigaidana, staggered shelves built into the wall. The shoin window, a rectangular opening with a built-in desk beneath it, framing a view of the garden like a living painting. The tsuke shoin, an attached veranda where one could sit with legs dangling, contemplating the rain. These were not movable elements. They were permanent, architectural statements of taste and refinement. Yet, the Shoin-zukuri retained the essential Japanese flexibility. The fusuma, sliding paper doors, could still reconfigure spaces. The shoji, translucent paper screens, still filtered light into a soft ambient glow. And the engawa, the wooden veranda that wrapped around the house, still served as the threshold between interior and exterior, between the human world and the natural one. The most magnificent surviving example of Shoin-zukuri is the Ninomaru Palace at Nijo Castle in Kyoto, built by the Tokugawa shoguns in the early 17th century. Its rooms are a masterclass in architectural psychology. The floors are designed to squeak, the so-called nightingale floors, so that no assassin could approach silently. The painted screens depict tigers and leopards, symbols of shogunal power. Yet the garden visible through the windows is pure zen, raked gravel, moss, and ancient pines. Power and transcendence side by side. In the late 16th century, as warlords battled across Japan for supremacy, a quiet revolution was taking place in a small, dimly lit room. Sen no Rikyu, the greatest tea master in Japanese history, was perfecting an architectural form so humble, so deliberately imperfect, that it seemed to mock the grandeur of the Shoin-zukuri. He called it the Sukiya, the place of refined taste, and it would change Japanese architecture forever. Rikyu's tea room was tiny, typically just 2 tatami mats, or about 3.6 square meters. The ceiling was low, forcing guests to enter on their hands and knees through a small crawl door called the Nijiriguchi. The walls were of rough plaster or unfinished wood. The tokonoma was reduced to its essence, a bare alcove where a single flower in a rustic vase might sit beside a scroll painted by a Zen monk. There was no painted screen depicting tigers. There was no gilded ceiling. There was only the play of light on rough surfaces, the sound of boiling water, and the profound silence of the moment. This was wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of impermanence, imperfection, and incompleteness, and it emerged directly from Zen Buddhism. In a world torn apart by civil war, Rikyu taught that true beauty lay not in grandeur, but in the weathered, the worn, the modest. A tea bowl should be irregular. A wall should show the marks of the plasterer's trowel. A beam should retain the natural curve of the tree from which it was cut. The Sukiya-zukuri took these principles and applied them to residential architecture. Unlike the rigid formality of the Shoin, the Sukiya house was informal, asymmetrical, and deeply personal. It used natural materials in their raw state: bark-covered columns, bamboo lattice, earthen walls with embedded straw. It celebrated the patina of age, the stain of rain on wood, the moss that grew between stones. The genius of Sukiya-zukuri was that it democratized beauty. The Shoin-zukuri required wealth, gilded screens, imported Chinese ceramics, armies of servants to maintain the garden. But anyone with a small plot of land and an eye for arrangement could create a Sukiya tea hut. It was architecture as spiritual practice, as personal expression, as resistance against the materialism of the age. Rikyu's influence extended far beyond the tea room. When the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the most powerful man in Japan, asked Rikyu to design his palace, the tea master created spaces of astonishing restraint amidst the warlord's ostentation. And when Rikyu was eventually forced to commit ritual suicide by Hideyoshi himself, a story of political intrigue that remains one of history's great tragedies, his aesthetic survived, encoded in the DNA of Japanese architecture. To this day, the Sukiya spirit lives in the traditional Japanese house. The preference for natural materials, the love of asymmetry, the belief that a space should feel lived in rather than displayed. All of this traces back to a single tea master who understood that the most profound luxury is the luxury of simplicity. While shoguns and tea masters debated the finer points of aesthetic philosophy, the vast majority of Japanese people, farmers, fishermen, mountain villagers, were building houses of extraordinary ingenuity and regional diversity. These were the minka, literally houses of the people, and they represent some of the most remarkable vernacular architecture in human history. The minka was not designed by architects. It was built by local carpenters, using techniques passed down through generations, adapted to local climate, available materials, and agricultural needs. And because Japan stretches from the subarctic north to the subtropical south, from volcanic highlands to storm-lashed coasts, the minka developed into an astonishing variety of forms. In the snowy mountains of Gifu and Toyama, the Gasho-zukuri house emerged, named for its steep thatched roof, which resembles hands pressed together in prayer. These roofs, pitched at angles of up to 60 degrees, shed the massive snowfalls of the Japanese Alps. Beneath them, houses reached 4 or 5 stories, with the ground floor reserved for living and the upper floors for raising silkworms. The thatch, made of miscanthus reeds, was incredibly thick, sometimes over a meter deep, providing insulation against temperatures that plunged below -20 degrees Celsius. Villages like Shirakawa-go and Gokayama, with their clusters of gasho houses, are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites, preserved as living museums of a way of life that endured for centuries. On the flat plains of the Kanto region, around modern-day Tokyo, a different form emerged, the Nagaya-zukuri, or row house. These were long, narrow structures built side by side, sharing walls with neighbors, their front rooms serving as shops and their back rooms as living quarters. The roofs were lower, the thatch thinner, and the construction lighter, an adaptation to the frequent earthquakes that shook the region. In the south, on the island of Kyushu, the Amamiya, or rain house, developed in response to torrential monsoon rains. These houses featured deep eaves, raised floors to combat humidity, and walls of mud plaster mixed with straw that breathed in the tropical heat. In Okinawa, the traditional house took on Polynesian characteristics, raised on coral stone foundations, with red-tiled roofs imported from Southeast Asia, and open walls that welcomed sea breezes. What united all these diverse forms was a common structural logic. The minka was built using the kiboko method, a post and beam frame of local timber, with walls of woven bamboo plastered with mud. The roof was the dominant element, often accounting for half the total volume of the house. Beneath it, the interior was a single large space, the hiroma, dominated by an irori, or sunken hearth, where the family gathered for warmth, cooking, and light. The minka was not just a house. It was a barn, a workshop, a stable, and a granary. In the gasho-zukuri, the upper floors housed silkworms during the spring and summer. In fishing villages, the ground floor might be open to the sea, with boats pulled directly into the house. In farming communities, the doma, the earthen-floored entryway, was where crops were threshed, tools were stored, and horses were tethered. This multifunctionality was born of poverty, but it created spaces of remarkable warmth and community. The irori was the heart of the house, and around it, 3 generations might live, work, and sleep in a single room. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed, but what was lost in privacy was gained in social cohesion. The minka was a machine for producing family. By the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, Japan had achieved something unprecedented in world history. After centuries of civil war, the Tokugawa shoguns imposed a peace so absolute that no major conflict occurred for over 250 years. The population exploded, cities swelled, and a new social class rose to prominence, the chonin, or townspeople, merchants and artisans who, despite their low official status in the Confucian hierarchy, became the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated class in Japan. Their houses, the machiya, are perhaps the most refined and complex residential architecture ever developed for urban life. The machiya of Kyoto, in particular, represent the pinnacle of this form. Long and narrow, typically just 5 to 6 meters wide, but stretching 20 to 30 meters back from the street. The machiya was designed to maximize space on expensive urban land. From the street, it presented a modest face, wooden lattice screens, a norin curtain above the entrance, and a tiled roof that seemed to press down on the narrow street. But step inside, and you entered a world of extraordinary depth and sophistication. The front of the machiya was the mise noma, the shop space, open to the street during business hours. Behind it lay the okunoma, the inner rooms where the family lived, increasingly private as one moved deeper into the house. At the very back, a small courtyard garden, the tsuboniwa, brought light, air, and the sound of water into the deepest parts of the house. This progression from public to private, from commerce to domesticity, was architectural genius. A merchant could conduct business in the front, while his family lived undisturbed in the back, all within a footprint smaller than a modern suburban garage. The machiya was a masterclass in natural climate control. The tsuboniwa courtyard acted as a cooling chimney in summer, drawing hot air up and out, while pulling cool air in from the street. The tori-niwa, a narrow passage running alongside the house, served as a light well and ventilation shaft. The udatsu, fireproof clay walls that projected above the roofline, prevented the spread of the fires that regularly devastated Japanese cities. And the inuri, curved bamboo fences along the street front, protected the walls from passing carts and animals, while allowing air to circulate. Inside, the machiya combined elements of Shoin, Sukiya, and Minka architecture. The main reception room featured a tokonoma and shigaidana in the Shoin style, signaling the owner's cultural refinement. The interior courtyard garden was designed in the Sukiya spirit, asymmetrical, natural, contemplative. And the kitchen, the daidokoro, retained the earthen floor and irori hearth of the rural Minka, a reminder that even the wealthiest merchant had roots in the soil. The materials of the machiya were chosen with obsessive care. The wooden lattice screens, koshi, were carved in patterns that identified the owner's trade. The red-brown tiles of the roof came from specific kilns. The cedar and cypress posts were aged for decades before use. Even the soil for the courtyard was selected for its color and texture. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of the machiya was its adaptability. As the family business grew, the house could be extended backward, upward, or sideways. As fashions changed, the interior could be reconfigured with new Fusuma paintings. And when disaster struck, as it inevitably did in a city built largely of wood, the machiya could be rebuilt using the same post and beam frame, the same joinery techniques, the same spatial logic. Today, Kyoto's machiya are disappearing at an alarming rate. Modern zoning laws, inheritance taxes, and the lure of apartment living have reduced their numbers from over 50,000 in the mid-20th century to fewer than 10,000 today. Those that remain have become precious relics, some converted into restaurants, boutiques, or guest houses, others preserved by families who refuse to let their heritage vanish. Walking through a machiya today is like walking through the soul of old Japan. Narrow, shadowed, infinitely layered. At the heart of every traditional Japanese house stands a figure who is part engineer, part artist, and part priest. The daiku, the master carpenter. In Japan, carpentry was never merely a trade. It was a vocation that demanded decades of apprenticeship, an almost spiritual relationship with wood, and a knowledge of joinery so sophisticated that it continues to astonish modern engineers. The Japanese carpenter's relationship with wood begins with the tree itself. Unlike Western carpentry, which often uses sawn lumber of standardized dimensions, traditional Japanese carpentry begins with a whole log. The daiku would study the tree, its grain, its curves, its knots, and decide how to cut it to maximize its natural strength. Some beams were left with their natural curvature, a technique called magomi, which distributed weight more effectively than straight beams. Others were split rather than sawn, following the grain to preserve the wood's resilience. The most famous Japanese timber is hinoki, Japanese cypress, which has been used in sacred construction for over 1,000 years. Hinoki contains natural oils that resist rot and insects, and its fragrance, clean, lemony, faintly medicinal, is considered purifying. The wood of the Kiso hinoki from the Kiso Valley was so prized that it was reserved exclusively for the construction of the Ise Grand Shrine and the Imperial Palace. A single beam of ancient hinoki can cost more than a luxury car. But the true genius of Japanese carpentry lies not in the wood itself, but in the joints that hold it together. The Japanese developed over 1,000 distinct joinery techniques, many of which require no nails, no screws, and no glue. The most famous is the Kanawa tsugi, the blind dovetail, which locks two beams together with such precision that they cannot be separated without destroying the joint. The osenu chigai, the crossed lap joint, distributes weight evenly across intersecting beams, and the aritsugi, the ant joint, uses interlocking teeth to connect posts and beams in a way that actually tightens under load. These joints were cut using a set of hand tools that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The noko giri, the Japanese pull saw, cuts on the pull rather than the push, allowing for incredibly thin kerfs and precise cuts. The kana, the Japanese plane, is pulled toward the body rather than pushed away, giving the carpenter exquisite control over the surface. And the nomi, the chisel, comes in dozens of variations, each designed for a specific joint or decorative cut. A master carpenter's apprenticeship typically lasted 10 years. For the first 3 years, the apprentice did nothing but sharpen tools and observe. For the next 3, he practiced basic cuts on scrap wood. Only in the final years was he allowed to work on actual construction. And even then, the most complex joints, the decorative transom carvings, the compound roof supports, were reserved for the master himself. This reverence for craft extended to the construction process itself. Before felling a tree for a major project, carpenters would perform a ritual offering to the spirit of the tree. Before raising the main beam, they would purify the site with salt and sake. The construction of a house was not just building, it was a collaboration with nature, with the gods, and with the generations who had practiced the craft before. The most astonishing example of this craft is the Kongo Gumi, a temple construction company founded in 578 CE, that remained in continuous operation for over 1,400 years until its absorption into a larger corporation in 2006. For 14 centuries, the Kongo family passed down the secrets of wooden pagoda construction, techniques that allowed buildings to withstand earthquakes, typhoons, and the slow decay of time. If the post and beam frame is the skeleton of the Japanese house, and the tatami is its skin, then the shoji and fusuma are its eyes, filtering, softening, and transforming light in ways that define the very experience of being inside. The shoji is, at its simplest, a wooden lattice frame covered with paper. But this simple description conceals a world of refinement. The lattice, the kumiko, is assembled from hundreds of thin strips of wood, joined with miniature mortise and tenon joints, so precise that they require no nails. The patterns range from the simple yokokaku, horizontal bars, to the intricate asanoha, hemp leaf pattern, a geometric design of interlocking triangles that symbolizes growth and resilience. The paper itself, washi, is a marvel of traditional technology. Made from the inner bark of the kozo tree, the mitsumata shrub, or the gampi vine, washi is stronger than ordinary paper by an order of magnitude. Its long, interwoven fibers create a material that is translucent, durable, and remarkably responsive to humidity. In dry winter air, washi shrinks and tightens, becoming almost drum-like. In the humid summer, it loosens and softens, allowing air to pass through. A well-maintained shoji can last for decades. The effect of light through shoji is one of the defining aesthetic experiences of Japanese architecture. Direct sunlight is transformed into a soft, ambient glow that eliminates harsh shadows and creates a sense of infinite depth. Colors become muted, softened to the pastel palette that Japanese aesthetes call shibui, understated beauty. A room lit by shoji feels larger than it is, calmer than it should be, as if the walls themselves have dissolved into light. At night, the effect reverses. From outside, a house with illuminated shoji becomes a lantern, its interior life visible as silhouettes, a figure moving across a room, the curve of a flower arrangement, the angle of a hanging scroll. The Japanese house, so private during the day, becomes strangely public at night, a gesture of trust toward the darkness. These are the sliding partitions that divide interior rooms, and they are covered with heavier paper or fabric, often painted with seasonal landscapes, floral motifs, or abstract patterns. Unlike the shoji, which is fixed in its frame, the fusuma is designed to be moved, reconfigured, removed. A room can be doubled in size by sliding back 2 fusuma. A corridor can become a bedroom by closing them. The fusuma makes the Japanese house a fundamentally theatrical space, a stage set that changes according to the drama being performed. The paintings on fusuma, often executed by master artists of the Kano school or the Rinpa school, were not mere decoration. They were integral to the architecture. A room painted with pine trees in winter became a winter room. A room with cherry blossoms was for spring. The imagery extended the architecture into the landscape, dissolving the boundary between the painted world and the real garden beyond. Maintaining shoji and fusuma was a constant labor. The paper had to be replaced periodically, a task that required removing the lattice frame, soaking off the old paper, and applying new sheets with a special wheat starch paste. Wealthy households employed specialists for this task. In poorer homes, the women of the household would repair torn shoji with patches, creating accidental collages of texture and tone that some aesthetes found more beautiful than pristine paper. In the modern era, glass and synthetic materials have largely replaced washi in ordinary houses. But the aesthetic logic of the shoji persists. In rice paper lamps, in frosted glass partitions, in the Japanese preference for indirect lighting. The idea that a wall should not block light, but transform it, remains one of Japan's great architectural gifts to the world. There is a space in the traditional Japanese house that has no exact equivalent in Western architecture. It is not quite inside, not quite outside. It is a wooden corridor, a veranda, a viewing platform, and a psychological buffer all at once. It is the engawa, and it may be the most philosophically profound element of Japanese residential design. The engawa runs along the exterior of the house, typically on the side facing the garden. It is a narrow wooden walkway, usually about a meter wide, with a floor of polished cypress or pine. On the interior side, shoji screens can be closed to seal the house against weather. On the exterior side, amado, heavy wooden storm shutters, can be closed for security. But when both are open, the engawa becomes a liminal zone, a place of transition between the human world and the natural one. To sit on the engawa, legs dangling over the edge, or tucked beneath in formal posture, is to occupy a space of contemplation. From here, one watches the rain fall on the garden, listens to cicadas in summer, observes the moon rising over the roofline. The engawa is the architectural expression of the Japanese concept of ma, the meaningful space between things. It is not a room with a function, it is a space for the absence of function, for the experience of simply being present. In the machiya, the engawa often runs along the tsuboniwa courtyard, creating a covered walkway that connects the various rooms while offering constant views of the garden. In the minka, a simpler version called the hisashi serves a more practical purpose, a covered area for storing firewood, drying vegetables, or sheltering from sudden rain. But even in its most humble form, the engawa embodies the Japanese refusal to draw a hard line between inside and outside. This refusal has deep cultural roots. In Shinto, the natural world is not separate from the human world. It is the dwelling place of the kami. The Japanese house, with its engawa open to the garden, its shoji filtering the landscape, its tatami the color of dried grass, is an attempt to live in harmony with, rather than opposition to nature. The engawa is the handshake between the two. In summer, the engawa becomes the coolest place in the house. In winter, it is the coldest, often left unheated, a zone of austerity that makes the warmth of the interior rooms feel more precious. Seasonal decorations appear on the engawa, mosquito cages in summer, chrysanthemums in autumn, pine and bamboo at New Year. It is a space that marks time, that registers the passage of seasons more precisely than any calendar. The engawa also serves a social function. In traditional households, guests would remove their shoes at the genkan, the entry porch, and step up onto the engawa before entering the main rooms. The engawa was a space of greeting, of informal conversation, of negotiations conducted before formal tea. To invite someone to sit on the engawa was a gesture of intimacy, not yet inside the family space, but no longer outside it. In contemporary Japan, the engawa has largely disappeared from ordinary housing, replaced by balconies of concrete and steel. but its spirit survives in the Japanese love of Engawa-like spaces. The wooden deck, the covered porch, the sunroom that blurs the boundary between interior comfort and exterior beauty. The Engawa taught Japan that the most important spaces are often the ones that are hardest to define. In the traditional Japanese house, the garden is not an accessory. It is not landscaping, not decoration, not a hobby for retired gentlemen with pruning shears. The garden is architecture, as carefully designed as the house itself, and in many ways more important. For while the house provides shelter, the garden provides meaning. The Japanese garden operates on principles that can seem paradoxical to Western eyes. It is not designed to be walked through, but to be looked at. It is not a collection of plants, but a composition of stone, water, sand, and moss, in which plants play a supporting role. And it is not a representation of nature, but an abstraction of it, a distilled essence of landscape that triggers the viewer's imagination. The most sophisticated technique of Japanese garden design is shake, borrowed scenery. The gardener does not merely design within the boundaries of the property. He designs the view, framing distant mountains, neighboring temples, or the silhouette of a pine tree on a hillside as if they were part of the garden itself. The garden becomes a lens, a carefully composed picture that extends far beyond its physical limits. A garden of 10 square meters can contain the universe if the shake is skillfully employed. The tsuboniwa, the courtyard garden of the machiya, is a masterpiece of compression. In a space often no larger than a parking spot, the gardener creates a world. A single stone becomes a mountain, a trickle of water becomes a river, a patch of moss becomes a forest floor. The sound of water, shishiodoshi, the bamboo water fountain that clacks rhythmically to scare deer, provides auditory architecture, marking time with its irregular beat. The dry landscape garden, the karasansui, takes abstraction to its extreme. Raked white gravel represents water. Stones represent islands. Moss represents land. Nothing moves, nothing grows in the conventional sense, yet the garden is never still. The raked gravel records the passage of wind, the shadow of clouds, the angle of the sun. It is a landscape painting made of earth, changed daily by the gardener's rake. The relationship between house and garden is mediated by architecture. The Engawa provides the viewing platform. The shoji frames the view like a picture. The tokonoma inside echoes the garden outside. A hanging scroll in the alcove might depict the same mountain visible through the window, creating a dialogue between representation and reality. In the most refined houses, the boundary between interior and garden dissolves entirely. Rooms open directly onto wooden decks that extend over ponds, so that one might step from tatami to stepping stone without conscious transition. The materials of the garden are chosen with the same obsessiveness as the materials of the house. Stones are selected for their shape, their texture, their history. Some are transported from distant riverbeds at enormous expense. Pine trees are trained for decades, their branches pruned and wired into sculptural forms. Moss is cultivated like a crop, watered and weeded until it forms a velvet carpet of impossible green. And like the house, the garden is never finished. It requires constant maintenance, raking, pruning, sweeping, replanting. A Japanese garden is not a product, but a process, a collaboration between human intention and natural growth. The gardener does not impose his will on nature. He negotiates with it, guiding the pine's growth, encouraging the moss's spread, accepting the stone's immovable presence. In this, the garden mirrors the house itself. Both are frameworks for the experience of time, space, and nature. Both require participation rather than mere observation. And both embody the central insight of Japanese architecture, that the built environment should not separate us from the world, but deepen our connection to it. We have talked about the architecture of the Japanese house, its timber frame, its paper walls, its garden views. But what was it actually like to live in one? What did a day in the life of a traditional Japanese household feel like, sound like, smell like? The day began early, with the sound of wooden clappers or temple bells marking the hour. In a minka, someone would rise before dawn to rekindle the irori, the sunken hearth, and prepare rice in an iron pot. The smoke from the hearth did not escape through a chimney. It rose through the thatch, preserving the roof and filling the house with the scent of wood smoke that would cling to clothes and hair for a lifetime. Bathing was a communal affair. The ofuro, a wooden bathtub, often made of fragrant hinoki, was filled with scalding water, and family members would wash themselves scrupulously outside the tub before immersing themselves in the shared bath. The same water might be used by the entire household, the eldest first, the youngest last. This was not considered unhygienic, but rather an expression of family intimacy. To share bathwater was to share something essential. Sleeping arrangements were fluid. There were no bedrooms in the Western sense. Futon bedding was stored in oshire, built-in closets, during the day, and laid out on the tatami at night. A room that served as a dining area at noon became a bedroom at 10 in the evening. The head of the household might sleep in the most formal room, near the tokonoma. Children slept near their parents. Grandparents had their own space, but rarely a separate room. Privacy was achieved through timing and discretion rather than walls. The kitchen, the Daikoku Bashira, was the spiritual center of domestic life. Named after the god of wealth, the central wooden post of the kitchen was considered sacred, often decorated with offerings. Cooking was done over charcoal braziers or in the irori, using techniques that required constant attention. There was no oven, no refrigerator, no running water. Food was prepared fresh for every meal, and storage was limited to what could be preserved through drying, salting, or fermentation. In spring, the shoji were replaced with lighter paper, and the house was open to the garden. In summer, sudare, bamboo blinds, were hung over the ingawa, and uchiwa fans appeared in every room. In autumn, the house was prepared for the cold, storm shutters checked, the irori cleaned, futon aired in the sun. In winter, the kotatsu, a low table with a built-in heater and a heavy quilt, became the center of family life. Everyone sitting with their legs tucked beneath the warm blanket. Social life within the house was governed by an elaborate etiquette. Shoes were never worn inside. The step up from the genkan to the interior was a step into a different realm. Guests were seated according to rank, with the most honored position facing the tokonoma. Tea was served with precise movements. The bowl rotated before drinking, the rim wiped clean. Even the angle at which one sat on the tatami conveyed social information. For women, the traditional house was both a domain and a constraint. The oku, the inner rooms, were their territory, and they ruled there with absolute authority. But they were also excluded from the omote, the public face of the house, where business was conducted and male guests entertained. The architecture itself enforced this division, with separate entrances, separate staircases, and rooms designed to keep the two spheres distinct. Yet within these constraints, there was warmth, humor, and profound beauty. The sound of rain on the amado shutters, the smell of incense in the tokonoma, the sight of grandchildren sleeping in a row on the tatami, their futon arranged like boats in a harbor. The traditional Japanese house was not always comfortable by modern standards. It was drafty in winter, humid in summer, and required constant maintenance. But it was alive in a way that concrete apartments rarely are. It breathed, it aged, it responded to the people who lived within it. Japan is one of the most geologically violent places on Earth. The archipelago sits at the collision point of 4 tectonic plates, and earthquakes are not exceptional events, but regular occurrences. Typhoons sweep across the islands every summer, bringing winds that can tear roofs from houses, and fire, from earthquakes, from lightning, from the ever-present hearts, has destroyed Japanese cities dozens of times throughout history. The traditional Japanese house was designed with this reality in mind. And remarkably, its very vulnerability, its lightness, its flexibility, its combustibility, was turned into a form of resilience. The post and beam frame of the Japanese house is not rigid. It is designed to flex, to absorb seismic energy through movement rather than resistance. The wooden joints, the mortise and tenon connections, the interlocking braces, allow the frame to sway during an earthquake without collapsing. Heavy elements, tile roofs, stone foundations are avoided precisely because they become deadly projectiles when the ground shakes. A thatched roof may catch fire, but it will not crush you. The genius of this approach was demonstrated most dramatically in the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which devastated Tokyo and Yokohama. Modern brick and concrete buildings collapsed by the hundreds, their rigid structures unable to withstand the shaking. But many traditional wooden houses survived, their flexible frames dancing with the earthquake rather than fighting it. The problem, of course, was fire. Within minutes of the quake, fires broke out across the city, and the wooden houses, so resilient to shaking, burned like tinder. Over 100,000 people died, many of them trapped in the narrow streets of traditional neighborhoods where fire could leap from roof to roof. This catastrophic vulnerability led to a fundamental rethinking of urban architecture. The Taisho and early Showa periods saw the introduction of fireproofing measures, plaster-coated walls, tiled rather than thatched roofs, wider streets to act as fire breaks. But it also led to a gradual abandonment of traditional construction in favor of reinforced concrete, which offered protection against both earthquake and fire. Yet traditional carpentry had one more lesson to teach modern engineers. In the 1995 Great Hanshin earthquake, which struck Kobe and the surrounding region, researchers were astonished to discover that ancient wooden temples and traditional houses often performed better than modern buildings of the 1960s and 70s. The reason was the Daiku's joinery, the complex interlocking joints that distributed stress throughout the frame, preventing the concentration of force at any single point. Modern seismic engineering has since incorporated these principles, developing seismic isolation systems that allow buildings to move independently of the ground. The traditional Japanese house, then, was not merely a victim of natural disaster. It was a teacher, a laboratory, a centuries-long experiment in how to build in harmony with a violent earth. Its lessons, flexibility over rigidity, lightness over mass, connection over isolation, are now central to modern earthquake engineering worldwide. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry's Black Ships steamed into Edo Bay, and Japan's 250 years of self-imposed isolation came to an abrupt end. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 transformed Japan from a feudal society into a modern nation-state almost overnight, and the traditional Japanese house faced its greatest crisis. The Meiji government was determined to make Japan equal to the Western powers, militarily, industrially, and architecturally. Western-style buildings sprang up across Tokyo and Osaka, brick structures with glass windows, chimneys, and parquet floors. The new elite, bureaucrats, military officers, businessmen, aspired to live in Western houses, with chairs instead of tatami, beds instead of futon, and fireplaces instead of irori. To be modern was to reject the past, and the traditional house became associated with backwardness, poverty, and feudal oppression. The government actively promoted Westernization. The imperial palace was rebuilt with Western-style reception rooms. The new railway stations, banks, and government offices were designed by foreign architects in neoclassical and Victorian styles. Even traditional craftsmen were sent to Europe to study Western building techniques. The Daiku, the master carpenter, saw his status collapse. What had been a revered profession became a dying trade, supplanted by factory-produced lumber and imported nails. Yet the transformation was not total. Many Japanese found Western houses uncomfortable, drafty in winter, hot in summer, and fundamentally unsuited to a culture that removed shoes at the door and sat on the floor. A hybrid style emerged, the Kanban mochi, or signboard house, which presented a Western facade to the street while retaining traditional Japanese interiors. The exterior might feature brick veneer, glass windows, and a tiled roof in the Western style. But step inside, and you would find tatami, tokonoma, and shoji. The most famous example of this hybrid architecture is the Rokumeikan, a Western-style reception hall built in Tokyo in 1883. Its architect, Josiah Conder, was a British architect who had studied Japanese traditional building and attempted to fuse the two traditions. The result was a building that looked European but was built using Japanese carpentry techniques, a cultural bridge that fascinated and confused Tokyo society. By the early 20th century, a backlash against wholesale Westernization had begun. Nationalist scholars and architects argued that Japan needed to preserve its architectural heritage, not as museum pieces, but as living traditions. The architect Ito Chuta, who had traveled extensively in Asia and Europe, began advocating for a Japanese-style modern architecture that retained traditional spatial concepts while using modern materials. His designs for the Tsukiji Honganji Temple and the Heian Shrine attempted to synthesize old and new, scale and spirit. But the forces of modernization were relentless. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 destroyed much of old Tokyo, and the rebuilding was largely in concrete and steel. World War II brought firebombing that reduced traditional neighborhoods to ash. By 1945, the traditional Japanese house was an endangered species, surviving mainly in rural areas, in the preserved districts of Kyoto, and in the nostalgic imaginations of a generation that had grown up in concrete apartments. If you walk through Tokyo today, you will see a city of glass and steel, of neon and concrete, of buildings that seem to defy gravity and logic. But look closer, and you will find that the traditional Japanese house never really died. It evolved, adapted, and reincarnated itself in the work of some of the world's most visionary architects. The post-war period brought a generation of Japanese architects who had grown up in traditional houses but were trained in modernist principles. They faced a profound question. How do you preserve the spirit of traditional architecture, its relationship to nature, its fluidity of space, its material honesty, while building for a modern, urban, industrial society? The answer came from many directions. Kenzo Tange, Japan's first Pritzker Prize winner, designed the Kagawa Prefectural Hall with a concrete frame that echoed the proportions of traditional wooden structures. His Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum used modern materials to create spaces of contemplation that recalled the tokonoma, not through imitation, but through the manipulation of light, proportion, and emptiness. But the true revolution came with the metabolists of the 1960s. Kisho Kurokawa, Kiyanori Kikutake, and Fumihiko Maki, who proposed that architecture should be organic, changeable, and responsive, like the traditional house with its movable screens. Kurokawa's Nakagin Capsule Tower was a radical reinterpretation of the modular, adaptable Japanese interior, each capsule a self-contained room that could be replaced, rearranged, or removed. It was the Shoin Zukuri, reimagined for the space age. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new generation emerged that engaged more directly with traditional materials and techniques. Kengo Kuma became famous for buildings that seemed to disappear into their surroundings, using natural wood, paper, and bamboo in ways that recalled the Sukiya spirit. His bamboo house and water glass project treated transparency and lightness as ethical positions, arguing that architecture should not dominate nature, but dissolve into it. His words echo Sen no Rikyu: architecture should be weak, not strong. Toyo Ito took the concept of the Engawa, the in-between space, and pushed it to architectural extremes. We began our journey in a pit dug into the earth 10,000 years ago, where a Jomon family huddled around a hearth, their thatched roof smoking in the rain. We traveled through the floating pavilions of Heian aristocrats, the austere tea rooms of Zen monks, the smoky interiors of mountain farmhouses, and the labyrinthine corridors of Kyoto merchants. We watched master carpenters cut joints of impossible precision, saw paper walls transform sunlight into gold, and sat on verandas where the boundary between inside and outside dissolved into mist. What have we learned? That the traditional Japanese house is not a style, but a philosophy. It is the belief that architecture should serve life, not dominate it. That materials should be honored, not conquered. That space should be fluid, not fixed. That beauty lies not in permanence, but in the graceful acceptance of change. The Japanese house was built to breathe, to expand in summer, contract in winter, to let light pass through paper, air pass through lattice, rain pass through thatch. It was built to move with the earthquake rather than resist it. It was built to be reconfigured, rebuilt, renewed. The Ise Grand Shrine is reconstructed every 20 years, not despite its perfection, but because of it. Perfection is not a state, but a practice, a continuous return to first principles. In our modern world, we build houses that are sealed, climate-controlled, permanent, and isolated from nature. We value energy efficiency, security, and durability. These are not bad things, but the traditional Japanese house reminds us of what we have lost: the scent of wood in the morning, the sound of rain on the roof, the play of light on paper, the feeling of a floor that yields slightly beneath your feet. The traditional Japanese house teaches us that a home is not a fortress against the world, but a conversation with it. That walls need not be barriers, that emptiness is not absence, but potential. That the most profound luxury is not space or ornament, but attention. The attention to arrange a single flower, to rake a patch of gravel, to sit in silence and watch the seasons change. As you close this video, look around your own space. However modern it may be, some echo of these ancient ideas reaches you. In the sliding door of your closet, in the paper lamp on your desk, in the plant by your window that reminds you of a garden. The soul of wood and paper is not dead. It is waiting, patient as a Zen monk, for us to remember how to listen. Thank you for joining this journey. May your own house, whatever it may be, breathe with the seasons and open to the light.